Task Force. The date is Wednesday, April 10th at 3:30 p.m. And pursuant to the open meeting law, any person may make an audio or visual video recording of this public meeting or may transmit the meeting through any medium. Attendees are therefore advised that such recordings or transmissions are being made, whether perceived or unperceived, by those present and are deemed acknowledged and permissible. And I'll ask the secretary to call the roll.
Okay, Kevin Aguirre, not here. Judith Conrad, I'm here. Carl Hetzler.
Here.
Mike Quinn, not here. Gloria Sadler.
Here.
Kathy Viveras.
Yeah.
Kevin.
Sherman Kamara.
Here.
And was that?
And Mr. Aguirre
Mr.
is
Aguirre
here.
is just-
Thank you.
Okay.
Right at roll call.
Okay.
Perfect. So citizen input is our first order of business. Any words of wisdom or invite? Certainly, anytime during the meeting, if you feel there's a need to interject, we welcome you to come down during the meeting. But we do have citizen input as an item on the agenda to assure that anyone can and will be heard initially. But in my practice of operating meetings, we do allow participation throughout the meeting. I'm pleased to welcome to Fall River and to our committee, Andrew Sheehan, who's the town manager at Middleton, Massachusetts. He's also a member of the Mass Municipal Association Form of Government Committee. So you'll be the second Form of Government Committee member. And if you could give us a little bit of background as we open our meeting. You've been introduced to all of the members prior to the meeting. Mm-hmm. So welcome to Fall River. Happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me down today. So I've been the town administrator in Middleton for the past about 3.5 years. Total time as a town administrator in Massachusetts, about 9 years. Here today representing, it's actually the Form of Government Committee of the Mass Municipal Management Association, which is a subgroup of the MMA. Slight distinction, but worked in a number of different forms of government, from town administrator with sort of weaker power, weaker authority, to a town manager form of government where the manager had a fairly strong amount of authority, as well as a plannee form in the city of Lowell, which is a city council, city manager form of government.
Great. And Lowell, in particular, is one of the communities that we are very interested in because it's a city somewhat comparable in size, demographics to a diverse as we are. Mm-hmm. And so I'd be interested in having you give us an explanation of your experience in Lowell, what kind of council they had. And I also want to interject that there was a second member, Bill Keegan, who was intending to be here today, but unfortunately an emergency meeting came up for him. He's willing to come on the 24th. In some ways it might be better. He was going to initially come on a telephone hookup connection, which our management information group managed to put together in anticipation of his coming. But on the 24th, he'll be able to come in person. And he is also a member of the Mass Municipal Management Association's Form of Government Committee. So, Mr. Sheehan, if you could just give us a little bit of background, and how long ago was it that you were associated with Lowell?
I was in Lowell from 2007 to 2009. So I was there as the assistant to the city manager, so sort of a chief of staff position. Mm-hmm. And the structure there is it's a 9-person council. It's a fully at-large council, so there are no ward councilors or precinct councilors. So it's a little different in that regard.
Although that is how we are also. We're a 9-member at-large.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize that. So the council picks really has only, I believe they have 3 hires: the city manager, the city auditor, and the city clerk. Everybody really reports to the manager. in Lowell in the Plan E form that they've adopted. And they've had the Plan E form, I think, since the 50s. It's pretty well established there. And so the manager is the contracting authority. He or she executes contracts, does all the hiring and firing, presents a budget to the city council for the council's adoption, and really is in charge of all day-to-day operations and primary policy making.
Is the mayor elected as a member of the council, or is he or she elected separate? Is there a mayor?
There is a
I guess.
mayor. It's a sort of ceremonial mayor, and the mayor is elected by the councilors on generally the first meeting in January after the election.
Okay. Is that generally a cohesive process? Because one of the things we find in Fall River, and particularly over the past decade or so, is that the position of council president, which is of course different than the mayor is elected separately as the chief executive of the city. But in the case of the council, with election of the president, there are usually more than one person that wants to be a council president, and that can sometimes be divisive, and it can last through the years, it can last through the decades.
Yeah, it can. And I even though I've been gone from Lowell for a long time, I live in Chelmsford, which is right next door. So I sort of still see what's going on and watch what's going on there. And there is that horse trading that, sometimes it's horse trading, you take it this year and I'll take it in 2 years. Or there's just, 2 or 3 people vying for votes. And there's generally some arm twisting or deal making behind the scenes to get votes for the mayor.
Do those alliances sometimes continue through the term of office, in terms of a separation between the mayor's team, if you will, versus
sometimes they do, but not always. Not always, and so it really depends on the individuals that are vying for the mayor's position and the full council itself, and whether there's this sort of inherent divisiveness already in place, and the two mayoral candidates are just sort of representative of those two different factions.
I'll open it to questions at this time. Ms. Conrad and Kathy, if you could just, there you go.
Incompetent, but well-meaning. I was just wondering, do you elect the mayor out of the pool of councilors, or is it?
Yes.
Yes, oh, okay. That's how it works in Cambridge, too, I think.
Yeah, so Cambridge and Worcester and Lowell all have the same form of government. I think there are some variations, but it's all Plan E form, and most of Massachusetts is either strong mayor or it's Plan E.
You yield, Ms. Conrad?
That's it.
Mrs. Viveras?
Thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
In our task, we're trying to determine a number of things. We have a strong mayor form of government. We have a city administrator, which is my role. But so we're trying to determine, or at least I personally would like to get a better understanding as whether this form of government has more autonomy. Do you find that the city manager has a lot more freedom and flexibility to make administrative decisions? Policy, I guess I'd ask specifically, how does the council weigh in regarding policy making? And could you just explain the differences in authority that would go with this form of government
Sure.
versus the strong mayor?
Yeah, I think obviously, well, I've never worked in a strong mayor form, so my thoughts on that are based on watching strong mayor forms from afar, whether it's Boston, Somerville,
Sure.
especially effective, highly effective mayors like that. Obviously, in a strong mayor form, the mayor has primary authority, really sets the agenda, sets the policy for the city. It's a little different in a Plan E form, where the council still has a role, but because of the authority of the manager, the city manager, more of that, it's more manager-driven, I think, than in a strong mayor form. And I think that you've reached out to Bernie Lynch, who was my boss in Lowell, and he could certainly speak to the sort of policy-making piece better than I can. But certainly the city council has a role to play in that, but I think the manager really kind of sets a course and tries to convince the council to go along with it, or build support for that.
So they're responsible for the budget, I'm assuming, right?
Yes,
Appropriations, all right. And then, do they pass ordinances?
They do, yeah, so
They
they're
do.
the legislative body.
Okay, so,
Like any council, so they pass ordinances, they don't do licensing, there's a separate council that does, a separate licensing commission that does that. But zoning changes, non-zoning ordinances, any types of appropriations or spending plans are approved by the council.
all right. So if the council decided that they wanted us, and I ask this question consistently, so if the council decided that they wanted to alter the mechanism for solid waste collection, and of course they appropriate the funds, and the manager may have a different view as to whether, how it should be conducted. And we went through privatization, so if the manager wanted to privatize and the council decided, no, we don't want to privatize, how would that ultimately work? I mean, how would that ultimately get resolved? The difference between the legislative and the manager?
So it's interesting you bring that up, because we went through a transition in solid waste when I was there. And I was there during the start and really the trough of the Great Recession. I started in the summer of 2007, and one of the last things that we did before we left was try to get the budget balanced for the start of fiscal 2010. And so we were going through a lot of different activities to try to balance the budget and reduce costs, particularly. When we went through the solid waste transition, that was really sort of a cooperative effort between the council and the manager. I think the manager came forth with the proposal, but really had to garner the support of the council in order to make some appropriations that would fund it. And so it ended up being, I think, everybody working on the same page for that.
And how did the unions factor into all of that? Clearly, unions can be a very strong, influence within a community. Councils have to get elected.
Right.
So how did the union piece of it?
Yeah, so the unions are quite strong in Lowell, and they tend to be in urban environments anyways.
Right.
And so there was, I'm trying to remember what we had beforehand. We went to automated collection. So the upfront cost for us was buying the bins, buying the toters for every household, and then it was a lot of just coordination and management of the process of the transition and really building, educating the community on how it was going to work. I don't recall that there was a significant union piece, because I think it was outsourced anyways. I think it had already been privatized, and we went from just people putting their own barrels out to putting out a city-provided toter. And the goal really was to reduce the solid waste and increase the recycling. And 10 years ago, 11 years ago, recycling was a much more lucrative market than it is now. So it really benefited us to push down the amount of solid waste, of disposable waste, and increase the amount of recycling. And that was, I think, one of the things that took some work in getting the council and the manager on the same page was what size toter to go to. Obviously, the smaller the trash toter, the less trash that goes out and the more recycling that goes out. And so the councilors, as I recall, were a little bit concerned about going too small with the trash toter and the residents being able to accommodate that and manage that change.
But it sounds like there were no significant union changes in terms of their
No, because I
operations
think
and
I
manpower strength?
think we had already privatized.
Okay.
And so it was an outside hauler anyway. So it wasn't like we were getting rid of the solid waste department.
Positions, yeah, okay. Okay.
We had plenty of other union issues to manage.
Okay. I'll yield for now.
Thank you. Ms. Sadler?
At the beginning of your dialogue with us, you mentioned that there were differences, stronger versus weaker roles of a city manager. Can you expand upon that?
I think what I said was in terms of town managers rather than city managers. So depending on the charter, a town manager, town administrator can have more or less authority. Most of the city charters, it's either a strong mayor or it's a city manager with the authority. And, you know, it's a strong mayor versus weak mayor / city manager.
Is that all?
Yes.
Mr. Hetzler?
Thank you. I have a few questions, so I'll try to ask the easier ones first.
Okay.
The shorter ones. In your experience, what's a typical term, and I know it's a contract negotiation type of thing, but what's a typical term that, you know, if a city like Fall River were looking to get a seasoned city manager, somebody with credentials and you know, a good record, what would it have to pretty much expect to have for a term in a contract?
Well, typically, contracts are 3 years, and you can go longer, but 3 is pretty normal, and that's the case in Lowell. The tenure of a manager really is dependent on the location. In Lowell, there's a fair amount of churn through city managers there. I think my boss there, Bernie Lynch, was there about 7 or 8 years, and that was one of the longest terms for a city manager. But that's based on the uniqueness of Lowell. You go to a place like Cambridge where the manager there was, he was there for 30 years, something like that. Retired a couple of years ago, and so you know, it really depends on the city.
Okay. In a city like Fall River where we have a strong mayor running every 2 years, constituent services are a big deal. Looking for votes, obviously, not going to not respond to somebody. I should say, I think I said that right. You get the point.
He's going to be responsive.
In a situation where you have a city manager and a city council is, obviously, they can answer their phones as well, but those constituent calls, were they coming into your office?
Most of them would come to our office, and we had a pretty robust constituent response team that would address those. Some of them go to the counselors because some people have a personal relationship with a counselor, and so they call that particular counselor up, and they say, hey, you know, can you do something about the potholes in front of my yard, or you know, trash on the sidewalks, or whatever it happens to be. Those would get funneled through us in various ways. Sometimes it would be in a more formal process where a counselor would file a motion. Prior to the meeting, it would get taken up, and the way that works is the counselor is asking the manager, so in the case of a pothole or a road repair, asking the manager to report back on the condition of the road in such and such a location. Other times, counselors would just call the office and say, hey, got a call from a friend, from a constituent, can you look at Main Street? in
Pretty
the
much
city?"
how it works now.
Yeah, I don't think I don't guess that it's very different. Constituent services are really important, whether it's a city manager, strong mayor, town administrator, town manager, we all have to deal with it, because whether we like to, and we like to say that we're not political, but we all work in a political environment. So if we're not dealing with those constituent issues, no matter what our title is, we're going to eventually have a problem with that.
Okay. What does the ceremonial mayor do in the arrangements that you've been in, where, I guess it was Lowell? And
Right.
is the mayor that was elected in Lowell to be the mayor through the city council, is he also the city council president?
Essentially, he is. He chairs the meetings, chairs the council meetings, chairs the school committee meetings. So by nature of his election by his peers as the mayor, he also assumes the role as school committee chairman.
Is he compensated for that extra?
The councilors all get paid, the mayor gets more. I don't remember what the difference is.
Okay, so there is a difference.
There is a
And
difference.
So what other responsibilities would this mayor, city council / mayor have?
Yeah, in many respects, the mayor is sort of the face of the city in a lot of celebrations and civic events. In Lowell, it's a very diverse community. A lot of different ethnic groups that are strongly represented in the city, and so there are very frequent ethnic events that take place, and so the mayor is often, at the flag raising for a particular group, or kicking off a parade to start the holiday season, something like that. And so I say ceremonial, not as a dig
No.
or a put down. It's largely that role. But the running of the council meetings and the running of school committee meetings is probably the most important part of what the mayor does.
Okay, so the city manager is more like and I don't mean to say it's locked into 9 to 5, but it's a 9 to 5 job, not out pounding the flesh on weekends, not out going to all of these, church festivals and things like that. That would still kind of be in Lowell anyhow. That would have fallen under the so-called mayor.
I suppose so. The manager that I worked with was very active, and so he was a frequent presence at a lot of functions. I mentioned the flag ceremonies. That was almost a weekend. Every weekend, it seemed there was at least one flag raising event for one group or another. I don't know that the manager went to many of those. Those were more mayoral duties. But he would be at the chamber meetings. He would be at other groups that neighborhood. There's a very strong neighborhood presence in the city. About 6 or 8, maybe even 10 different neighborhood groups that meet pretty regularly to advocate for their areas, and the manager would be a pretty regular presence at those meetings.
Last question. Sure. Recently, the state of Massachusetts adopted legalizing marijuana.
Mhm.
And communities have the authority to start the process with the so-called letters of non-opposition. In the city of Fall River, our mayor has the authority to sign letters of non-opposition. Many have been signed, and from my talking to city councilors, some of them are surprised at how many are signed, not in agreement with how many are signed, but in Fall River, it is the mayor's job. He has that authority. Who has that authority if the new law is in place now? So put yourself in a Lowell situation. Somebody wants to open up a marijuana shop or cannabis, I don't know what we call them legally, but a marijuana shop in
Sure.
Lowell. Is it the city council that would vote and then authorize the city manager to sign? Or could the city manager unilaterally, I know he might be cutting his own throat, but would, under the state law right now, to the best of your knowledge, would that city manager have the authority to sign those letters of non-opposition?
I'm actually not sure about that. The council is the ordinance authority, so the zoning would have to be in place for it. My guess, and don't hold me to it, my guess is that if the zoning is in place, then the manager probably has the authority to sign the non-opposition letters, but I don't know for sure.
So you're the town manager of Middleton. Has anyone approached you for a letter of non-opposition?
No, we voted early on not to support, not to allow medical or recreational marijuana. So we've got bylaws in place that would prevent it. So it'll never, well, until such time as the zoning changes, it'll never come to my desk. But that would be a Board of Selectmen authority in a town.
So you know right now that if that did come to your desk, it would go back, it would bounce down to the Board of
Bounce to the-
Selectmen, which in our case
Bounce
would be
up.
like, oh, bounce up,
Yeah.
City Council.
Yeah.
Okay. I yield. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Aguirre, do you have anything at this point? Interestingly, though, the letter of, just to close out that topic, the letter of non-opposition is not the granting of a license or the ability to operate a business. That's done, as I understand it, and Mrs. Viveras is more familiar than I am, but that would be done through the state commission.
Right.
That makes that final decision. So the letter of opposition is just a step in the process. You mentioned Plan E form of government as the operation in Lowell. I understand, and I don't know if you know this to be a fact, have basically those plans A through E been dissolved, and now every charter is a home rule charter in essence? Is that the way it's moving?
Essentially, but I think because of the tradition of the plan forms, I'm sorry, was I supposed to put this on, or has it been on?
I hope it's been on, but I don't know.
Okay, it's on.
The switch is up toward you.
I think out of tradition, the forms or the plans have been adopted. It always, since the Home Rule Act went into effect in the 1960s, it's been a legislative process anyways, and so and we're all great plagiarists, so we find something that fits what we want to do, that's already being done somewhere else, and we take that. So if and the same thing goes for towns that want to go to a town council. There are a number of towns that have a council form of government, so they really have a city form, but they're still known as a town. Palmer is one. I think Franklin has that form. Methuen up in the Merrimack Valley has that set up. So it still goes through the legislative process.
And there are communities like Framingham, right, that went from being a town to being a city fairly recently.
Yeah, so last year we had two. We had two that I'm aware of. We had Framingham that went to a strong mayor, and Amherst that went to a city manager form, or town manager form, town council.
How familiar are you with those two communities and, the mechanics and also the politics of why they made the decision, one to be a strong mayor form of government, the other one to be a city or town manager form of government?
So Framingham is not too far from where I grew up. It's a really big town. It's like 60,000 people. So I think it's was the most populous town in the Commonwealth. And so, I think for them, it made sense to go to a city form in whichever form they chose. It gets voted by the public, by the voters, and what was brought forth was a proposed charter with a strong mayor form of government. Out in Amherst, I think the difference there may have been that maybe they weren't. Sometimes it comes down to the people not wanting to sort of acknowledge that they're a city. And so by going to a town council form, it's not as dramatic a change. And I think they've been very successful in Amherst, particularly with good town managers over the years. And going from a town manager to a city manager made sense because it didn't seem like that dramatic a change.
So I'm a little confused. In Amherst, they went from a town manager to a city manager?
Correct.
But Amherst is still a town,
Still a
right?
town, yeah.
So-
But they went to they went from a representative town meeting to a town council.
Okay.
Kept the town manager. I think the manager now, under the new form, has more authority than he had previously.
So they had a manager under both the town meeting form as well as the town council form. And at some point, the title was changed from town manager to city manager?
Still town, I think it's still town manager, but officially it's a city form.
With a greater
town
authority.
of. Yeah, there's a number of communities in the state that are, the city known as the town of. The interesting thing about Framingham, and I don't know the dynamics of all that went on, I think it was a fairly close vote. I think one of the councilors was elected mayor, and the outgoing town manager stayed on through the transition when the form of government changed, and then the new mayor, brought in a former mayor to be the city administrator. I don't know what the title is, but whatever the comparable title is, it's a former mayor who also has town manager or quasi-town management experience. He was, if you're familiar with the old Fort Devens, which is up on Route 2 just before Fitchburg, the military base largely closed down, sort of turned it in, the mass development turned it into a town, but it's not really a town by itself. It's sort of it's a creation of the state. It's not the 352nd town. It's like, we still have 351 plus Devens. But, so Thatcher Keyser, who was at one time had been the mayor in Amesbury, he became the director at Devens and now is the city administrator, or whatever the title happens to be, in Framingham.
There is some consideration that a change might be a cost-saving measure also. And I think that might occur if there were a change in number of councilors. For instance, we have 9 councilors. If we did move toward a city manager form of government, there might be some interest in doing some kind of a geographic representation, not necessarily ward councilors, but possibly ward councilors, or possibly sections of the city councilors, kind of north, south, east, west, central kind of concept that I've thought about, at least. In case of Lowell, I don't know if you know the salary scale for the mayor / council president and the city manager, but I'd be interested in knowing, what their salary levels might be for both positions.
Yeah, I don't recall what the councilors and the mayor, what their salaries are. The manager, I'm guessing it's in the 150 to 180 range. It's the 4th largest community in the Commonwealth. It's a very difficult place to work. The official population is probably 110,000. The true population is probably 130. There's a lot of undocumented or uncounted residents, and all squeezed into a fairly small geographic area. So it's a challenging place to work, and it's a demanding place to work. So you have to pay for that. The difference with Lowell compared to a place like Cambridge, where I mentioned Bob Healy was the manager for several decades in Cambridge. Lowell, as I said earlier, there's a lot of churn in the city manager position there. The average is probably 4 years, and many of the managers that Lowell has hired over the years have had a political background. They're former state reps or former state senators, even at least 1 or 2 now that I can think of that were at one time city councilors and mayors in their background. And so there's a tradition there of hiring political people to be the manager. The difference in Cambridge is that Bob Healy was, he was a professional manager. The council let him do what needed to be done. So there's a lot of cost avoidance in that. You look at the salaries, and the salaries are dramatically different. Cambridge, for lots of reasons, the salary was significantly higher when Bob was there. I think considerably higher now with the current manager. But there's a lot more to it than just what the salaries are. There's cost avoidance, and I think that's what you really have to look at in evaluating the benefits and the liabilities of a change in government, or looking at your current form versus a potential different form, is, you know, where are you likely to avoid costs, and I think that's an important consideration. Hard to quantify, but I think it's an important consideration.
Mr. Healy was the long-term city
yeah.
manager, right, the 30-year.
Yeah, in Cambridge.
Just a related
Sure.
question. So is the mayor who's elected by the council, is that a full-time position or a part-time position?
Kind of depends on the individual. There's it's a heavy demand.
Yeah, I was
It's a
getting
heavy
back to the
demand.
salary
Yeah,
issue.
just use your mic,
Paid,
Mr. Bruce.
If they're paid as a full-time person, you know, with a lot of activity, and I was just curious if.
Yeah, and again, I apologize that I don't have a ballpark figure to even throw out for,
But even just full-time versus part-time, I
yeah.
mean, there'd be a
It's-
salary
It
adjustment.
it typically requires, I would say, probably in the order of 10 to 20 hours a week on the part of most mayors. Some take it more, seriously than others, if they have the time. A number of mayors that I'm familiar with were retired when they became mayor, so they had time. They could devote 30 or 40 hours. They don't have they have a staff. They typically don't have regular office hours. When I was there was a staff of 2 in the mayor's office, and most of that is constituent services, the issue that you raised earlier, and scheduling for all these various events.
Do you have other questions,
I
Mrs.
did,
Ferris?
I
Go
didn't want
ahead.
to interrupt.
Well, you already did.
Well, I just want a clarification, so I was going to
Well,
yield back.
that was a point of
That was
clarification.
a point of clarification,
Yes.
yeah, when you ask salary.
Well, I'll
full-time,
yield.
part-time.
I'll
Okay,
yield
well,
to you,
thank
Mrs.
Mr. Chairman,
Ferris.
I appreciate that. Regarding your evaluation, so how is that executed? Who gets involved with that? I'm assuming the council must have a role to play, but could you just explain what that evaluations process looks like?
Yeah, I don't recall how often the manager was evaluated when I was in Lowell.
Well, even now.
oh,
your
even
current-
now.
Even now, your
Yeah,
current
so-
position, what's standard?
Ideally, it would be annually.
Okay.
And there's been a change in some of the procedural elements because of a court case that came down last year. Typically, what happens is that each of my 5 selectmen evaluates me individually, and then there is a consolidated evaluation that is presented in public.
Do they set goals for you? I mean, how are
Yes.
they?
Yeah, so they do, and that's something that is, it varies from town to town. Some towns are very strict about that, and it's on the calendar, and they start that process the same time every year, and they wrap it up the same time every year, and the evaluation flows out of that. Other communities, it's less formal, or it's less established. I succeeded a 34-year incumbent, and so the Board of Selectmen hadn't been in the practice of doing an evaluation of him, and so it's been an adjustment for them to get into that, and they've evaluated me once. I expect to be evaluated again later this spring, but it's not what they're it's not what they're used to. So it just takes some reminding to get that to happen.
But it doesn't sound like it's necessarily measurable, that they set specific goals
My
they
board
need
does
you to-
set, they set broad goals, so it's not a to-do list.
Okay.
It's broader than that. And so then there's some variation or there's some interpretation into whether I've met a goal or not, because it's a little more nebulous. So I do know managers that really, they get a sort of to-do list from their Board of Selectmen. And in that regard, it's pretty easy. You kind of go through and you go, yep, I did that, and I did that. I prefer a broader approach to goal setting, and I'm happy to advocate on my own behalf when the time comes for my evaluation.
And I think it's an important point, because if your goal in moving to this form is to add maybe a heightened level of professionalism, a heightened level of accountability, and maybe even independence, there's a lot of speculation in communities where you have a strong mayor form of government, and even others, which is boards of selectmen, that the politics is really driving the decision-making within the community, and decisions aren't being made based on best practice or best cost efficiencies, but rather based on, political considerations. And
Right.
so when the manager gets evaluated, it shouldn't be, well, I like, Andy, he's a good guy, and, always takes care of my constituent requests, and therefore he should stick around. That kind of speaks back to the whole evaluations process. So are you
Yeah.
comfortable that you're actually going to be evaluated based on what you've accomplished and what you've been able to achieve, as opposed to whether or not you've managed to, remain friendly with the people who are conducting your evaluation?
Yeah, that's a really important point. I'm comfortable operating in that environment. I also know that right now, like I said, I have a 5-member board. I've got 5 strong supporters on my board. That could turn quickly, and I've seen boards of selectmen turn in, flip completely in 18 months. And the same thing could happen. I mean, that could
Right,
happen
right.
in one election in the city. And so, as professional managers, we have to always be trying to satisfy the council, satisfy the public, and hope that even if I'm a city manager or a town manager, whatever it happens to be, and I've got a majority of councilors or selectmen that are not my biggest cheerleaders, at the very least that I can say, well, this is what the council wanted or the board wanted, and I delivered, and begrudgingly or not, they have to say, hopefully, he did. We're not inviting him over to the cookout, but he's doing what we said. So, so it's not for everybody, but I mean that's what we all sort of sign on to when we become professional managers.
Just a little while ago, you mentioned a court case. What
Yeah.
specifically was that?
Yeah, so it had to do with it was an open meeting law case, and
Just if I may interject, is this about Lowell?
no,
Or
this
what's
is
the court case?
this is about performance evaluations generally, and it was so in the prior to this court case, the selectmen, or I suppose the same would apply to city councilors, could individually evaluate the manager, give all of their individual evaluations to the chairman. The chairman would consolidate it all into a summary and present that to the manager. Somebody appealed that process, said that it was violative of the open meeting law, and the courts came down and they said, yeah, it is. It really should happen in a more public way. It can still, much of it can still happen the same way, that the individual members do the evaluations, but rather than giving it to just the chairman who then consolidates it, it has to be presented in a more public forum.
So can you evaluate your superintendent similarly, right?
It changed.
Yeah,
Oh,
you're
it
right,
did
so the same
change?
thing would
Yeah,
happen with,
okay,
with a
right.
school superintendent.
It changed that the secretary
Was the one that had to compile it, basically.
Right. Yeah.
And the subcommittee then reported that out. In the past, it was an elected person that did that compilation, so.
Huh.
It was very minor, but it was just more transparent, I guess.
Yeah,
You had to
okay.
know what each individual person felt rather than try and guess
Yeah,
through.
because it sounded similar, yeah,
Yeah.
okay, all right, thank you. I yield.
Other questions from members? Yes, Mr. Hetzler?
Is there a requirement that you know of to be able to be hired as a city manager? Anything mandated by the state or whoever oversees these forms of governments?
No, no. And so you get people that have MPA degrees, Masters in Public Administration. Like I said, in Lowell, the tradition has been to hire politicians more often than professional managers, so there's no requirement.
No, you, Mr. Hessler. Now, generally, I perceive of city manager forms of government as a council serving as, in essence, a board of directors, and the mayor or the council president serving as chairman of the board, and therefore having more influence than the other council members because he's chairman of the board. Clearly, in a corporate world, if someone's chairman of the board, they're usually someone that has significant influence. So I think that as I approach this, I never wanted to minimize what the mayor might become. Now we clearly have a strong mayor form of government, and everyone understands that that mayor, he or she, is always the pinnacle of the decision-making process, and all things need to basically go through that mayor. If we did move toward a city manager form of government, my sense is that we would have the opportunity to have a more professionally operated government, but that also whoever would become the mayor or the council president, whatever that title would be, would still be more than just ceremonial. It would not be relegated to just kissing babies and marching in parades and hoisting up flags. That person would become a significant force as a result of being chairperson of the board. Do you see that? And from your knowledge of communities, particularly urban communities, is that the case?
Yeah, I would say it's sort of unwritten, but I think from my experience in Lowell, at least, the mayor had a little bit more influence than the rest of the councilors. The manager is the chief executive officer. The council is more like a board of directors and the legislative. And I suppose you think of the mayor as the Speaker of the House. Speaker of the House is just a member of the House, but he or she isn't really just another member of the House. There's a little bit more cachet that goes with the speakership or the Senate presidency or whatever
Sure.
whatever your
Particularly
legislative.
in Massachusetts, the Speaker of the House
Yeah.
is a force to be reckoned with. Actually, Mr. Aguirre is a former member of the House, so he's sort of our expert on the workings of that august body. You had mentioned also Bernie Lynch. Bernie, that name was not familiar to me until you mentioned it, but
Oh, okay.
he was the city manager when you were
When
working.
I was there, yes.
Okay, he's no longer the city manager now?
No, he's
Yeah.
retired.
Right. Okay, and I think there's a woman now who's manager in Lowell. I
Yeah,
believe.
Eileen Donahue is
Eileen.
the current manager. She's been there 2 years maybe. She was a counselor. Counselor when I was there, had been mayor previously, and then became state senator. And then when the position opened, she came back to be city manager.
Right, and I have been in touch, and I'll share with my colleagues after we've concluded this part. I've had communications with several people in Lowell several people in Cambridge. They really are quite different, aren't they, in terms of how they operate and the authority of the council and the authority of probably the city manager as well. In Cambridge, my sense is the city manager is a significant piece of the operation, and the council is, and Mrs. Viveris was speaking to their positions. I think if they're not full-time, they're paid almost as if they are full-time, and they each have staff.
Yes,
Each of the
I believe that's
councilors
true.
have staff. So is that also true in Lowell, to your knowledge?
No, only the mayor had staff. The other councilors, they were just part-time. You know, there was nothing close to part-time for the 8 that were not mayor. No staff, no office, no desk, and, you know, they would show up on Tuesday nights or whatever night the meetings were. They would do, you know, they would be present at certain events in the city throughout the year. But quite a bit different from Cambridge or Boston, where those are full, the council positions are really kind of full-time
Okay.
positions.
How about Worcester, to the extent, do you know anything about Worcester?
I don't know too much about Worcester. It's the same form.
Nine-person
I
council,
think it's a
all elected at
9-person
large.
council. One of my colleagues on the form of government committee, Julie Jacobson, used to work in Worcester, I believe. I think she was an assistant city manager there. I don't know if she's available for any of your meetings or even to call in. She could give a better sense of how Worcester operates.
Where is
She's
Julie?
in Auburn,
In
Auburn,
Auburn.
Massachusetts, yeah, which is right next to Worcester.
Is she still working?
She's the town manager in Auburn, yeah.
Town manager, okay. Okay, Mrs. Viveris?
Regarding, you mentioned it's typically a 3-year contract. How does that parallel with the local elections?
Generally, it straddles the elections. So, when my boss went in, he went in '06. There had been an election in November of '05. So the new council took office in January. The manager left. They brought in Bernie Lynch, my boss, and it's a 2-year term. So in November of '07, there was another election, fairly sizable shift in the council, but he had another year, a year and a half left on his contract. So I think he made it through probably three electoral cycles, and he just retired. It was just time for him.
But it would seem that would be important. We started with a 3-year contract term in the position, and then at some point, it got rolled back to a 2-year term, which was also coterminous with the mayor.
Okay, yeah.
And again, the council had to approve 3-year contracts, whereas 2-year contracts did not require council approval, so that was part of the shift. But I'm just curious, it would seem that there would be a real benefit to having that, even if it's just by virtue of the continuity, and even to get past the politics, then at least the manager then has a year to prove him or herself to a newly elected body before being immediately
Yeah.
replaced, or?
Right, and actually, as we're talking, I'm thinking, I don't know if the current the current manager in Lowell has a contract. My boss did when we were there, when he was there. So, and it seems to me that not all of the managers had contracts over the years, and that, you know,
Is that
that's
common? Is it?
I don't think it's common, no. I can't think of another place where that
Yeah,
takes place.
sounds-
It's dangerous to the individual, frankly. And it's certainly not common in other parts of the country. And I should point out, the council manager form of government is the most common form throughout the country. and more common even than a strong mayor. Strong mayor is more, I think, of a big city and northeast setup. But you get out into the Ohio Valley and the Midwest and the Southwest, the primary form of government is a council-manager form. And almost always, there's a contract in place. But you're right, if it's a 3-year contract, it gives the manager some opportunity to prove him or herself to a new council, even if it's a council that didn't choose that person.
Right.
And the other thing I'll add is that if you're hiring a professional manager, we are all very reluctant to take a position without a contract, because we can't be that exposed to political change.
Right.
And it hasn't always been the case in Lowell, because Lowell so often had political hires as their managers. So they were sort of political beings anyways, and, didn't really, maybe didn't occur to them that a contract would be that advantageous.
Currently, is Lowell going through another transition or a change? I know there are also lawsuits. When you mentioned lawsuits, I know Lowell is under some kind of a lawsuit because of lack of, is it because, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but is it because of lack of representation by its officials to reflect the diversity of that community?
Yeah, I think there's a long-standing Department of Justice complaint there. I don't know if it's a court case per se or an investigation that's sort of never-ending, or, but, it's a very white council in a very brown city. And it's the second most populous Southeast Asian community in the country. Stockton, California is the only city that has a greater Southeast Asian population. There's a great diversity of Latin American influence in the city. It's interesting. There's not a lot of. It didn't strike me as being a lot of African Americans in Lowell, but there are a lot of Native African that have emigrated into Lowell, and so you get there are these clusters of people from Cameroon and Ivory Coast and other places like that, but it's different from what you see in a lot of urban areas. So there are some voting rights challenges or charges over the years about the council not representing the population, the diversity of the population.
So it really has nothing to do with city manager form of government in Lowell as much as the elected officials.
Correct. Yeah, it has to do with the fact that they're all at large, and I think part of it is particularly with the Southeast Asian population, but probably some of the other minority populations as well. They have a sort of inherent distrust of authority, and so they tend to vote at lower rates than certain other groups. And so even maybe they want to be represented, or maybe they don't, because they don't trust the process to even get to that point.
Right.
So I don't know what the current status of that, and again, I don't know if it's a case, an active case, or what it is, but it was being chatted about when I was there 10 years ago.
Well, excellent. I appreciate the information you've provided. We've had two of you from this form of government committee. I'll have to forward to Joff Beckwith that the representation that you've both provided us has been very valuable as we muddle through this process and determine where we're going to go with this. So, if there are no further questions of Mr. Sheehan, we can give him great appreciation and encourage him to hang out in Fall River for a while if he wants to.
I have to grab dinner while I'm here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's a good possibility.
Do you mind calls from any of us if we have?
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all.
Do we have his contact?
I have his contact. Do you have a business
I do.
card that you can give us, Secretary, and it can be incorporated in the minutes? If you have two of those, I'll take one too.
I'll leave you all that I've got. Make sure they're all mine, though.
Credit cards?
Credit cards, I've got credit cards, blank checks.
Thank you. Are there any other words of advice you'd like to leave us with, or any recommendations on who you think might, I made note of Julie Jacobson. I have a few others. Mayor Di Pasquale has been particularly good in reaching out to me and wanting, he was supposed to come connected to us. He's the mayor of Cambridge, and he was actually city manager of Cambridge, right? And he was intending to be connected to us, but then he wanted to hold off. He invited us to go to Cambridge, so we can discuss that.
And I think you spoke with Michael Dutton from
Yeah, Michael was
Bridgewater.
here. Yeah, he was here for a previous meeting.
And so he, he's got a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience, and so that was a good place to start. And
And then Bill Keegan was.
Bill
That's
too,
good.
Bill's got a great wealth of knowledge and experience too, so he'll be able to fill in a lot of the gaps too, so.
Yes, Mrs. Conrad?
I actually would like to know a little bit about Middleton, Massachusetts, while you're here.
You don't all know about Middleton?
Very
So
little.
Middleton is North Shore. It is right off of 95, near Danvers. Danvers is one of our neighbors. Middleton is a little under 10,000, so fairly small. Has doubled in size in the last 30 years because people finally found it. It's a convenient commute to Boston, convenient commute to the seacoast of New Hampshire and Maine, Merrimack Valley. So it's 10 miles from Middleton Center to Route 495 and 4 miles or so to Route 95. And so it was a farming community, and now it's a bedroom community.
Does
Nice
it have a
place.
rail line?
It does not have a rail line. The closest rail is in, Beverly is only 2 towns away. Beverly has 5 stops. Salem is close, has a couple of stops. I forget if there's a stop in Peabody. There must be a stop in Peabody, or 2, so we're close, but not quite there. That's actually one of the things we're trying to figure out is how to get people to public transit. It's sort of what they refer to as the first mile, last mile. And we're like the last 5 miles. So it's a little hard, but traffic is a big issue for us because there's no other way to get around.
Thank you.
And add it to your places to go visit. To beautiful Middleton. Great. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll excuse you from the table, but.
And good luck. Good luck
Yeah.
in your process and your explorations and whatever you end up doing, if you do a change or you don't do a change.
Sure. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sheehan. Okay, as I mentioned, Mr. Keegan was the town manager of Foxborough, had intended initially to be connected to us by telephone, and then was going to come, and then he had to cancel. So he is available for a future gathering. He did say if we wanted him to be here, he'd be able to be here on April 20th. So, and there'll be a point at which we'll say we've gained enough answers from enough managers to have a sense of what a manager is and how that might impact our city and whether or not we want to even consider moving in any direction toward that end. I always keep the public option open, so Mr. Venice is a loyal attendee and student of government. So if at any point you want to speak out, you're welcome. Establishing the next priorities. Certainly, I think at some point we're going to get close to saying, do we want to have a document that goes to the council? I don't know if we're there yet, that we want to even consider drafting anything. I did receive, and I'm trying to locate it, I think I might have it on my desk, but I did receive from someone a model charter, if you will, that was the charter of a city manager form of government. So we don't have to rewrite, as was mentioned by Mr. Sheehan, plagiarizing, which I hate that word and hate the concept of what it is. But certainly, if we're going to create a language amending our existing charter, there's no need for us to create it from nothing. We take a look at models that exist that would work for us. But I don't know if we're ready to be there. Also, I think the one other thing that I'd mentioned at our last meeting, and I want to reemphasize it at this meeting since we now have an actual invite, if there's a time between now and the 24th, a day, if you will, that we might do a road trip. I was thinking particularly, and this could be limited to one community, although I was thinking if we could do a morning and an afternoon, that we might choose two, and I thought Worcester and Cambridge, basically Lowell being a little further out there, that if we did just Worcester and Cambridge, I think that would provide us with some good insight into two communities that have different forms of city managers. The city manager form in Cambridge strikes me as being a very interesting and strong leadership because of its history of hiring professional city managers. I'm a little bit leery of getting connected to Lowell because I'm not sure that I would want to see us move toward a city manager form of government where the history, as is with Lowell, is primarily politicians that get appointed to the city manager positions. I think we've got, if we move toward a professional city manager, that's where I hope we would go, to a professional city manager, not to the appointment of some retiring legislator or whatever. So that's why I thought Cambridge and Worcester would be two good options. So priorities, where do you want to go from here?
So
Just make sure you switch this up on your mic and you're talking.
after listening to what you just said, I agree with a lot of your thoughts in the sense that one of the things that struck me with, two things that struck me with Lowell, high turnover, which, we're going through high turnover right now, it seems, with a strong mayor. And we see what that ends up leading to with no consistency. So that was concerning to me. But then when he spoke about, recycling politicians into that position, it made me think of our current housing authority without picking on them for any reason. It just seems like that's what it came to. So what is this going to create? A position where ex-politicians that need to get a few more years in their pension, toward their pension, get this job? That doesn't serve us well either. So with that, it came to my mind that what would be the next priority for me? It would be, I'd like to see the Worcester model, and whether that is having them show up in person or speak to them by phone. I'd like to see the Worcester model because it seems as though Worcester has been a city on the move, a city that has been growing with jobs and infrastructure and everything else, and it would be interesting to see how that's playing out. But also, I like to look at these charters a little bit because I don't know that it's this task force's responsibility or whose responsibility it would be if, in fact, we said as a task force, we think it would be worth exploring a city manager type of government here in the city of Fall River. And now here's a charter that we think would be, the roadmap that we should follow. Is that, and I'll ask the question to you, is that what you feel one of our roles would be? If we're going to make that suggestion, to also submit a sample charter that we think would be, a good model to follow? Or is that going to be left to the city council, the mayor's office, or some other body that says, okay, we're going to explore this a little more, but we're going to write the language for the map that we're going to follow. Because I think the language of the charter is going to be the most important part of this. You could have a city manager type of government with a city council and mayor, as he was suggesting that Cambridge has, or Lowell has, and it could be successful, or it could fail. And I think the difference is going to be based on how the charter is written and who has authority and what authority is granted without all this infighting and everything else. And I think that's the most important piece of it. So I'll ask the question to you. Do you feel it's our job as this task force to present two things to the city council? One is a recommendation on a form of government, and the second is, and here's a charter that we think should be the language that gets incorporated.
Yes, I do think that the purpose of this task force is to recommend language that would not be a new charter, but it would be an amendment to the charter.
Okay.
So I don't see us, in fact, the Corporation Council is very often talks about staying in our lane. I thought that maybe we should evolve into something more than just talking about the city manager amendment to the charter. For instance, I submitted a resolution after this recall process to give us the responsibility to also comment on the recall process. I think there's certainly a public demand out there that maybe that the recall process should be looked at. And it did, in my opinion, pass the council on a 4-3 vote, but it was ruled to not pass because of a belief that it took 5 votes for something to pass. I actually think that that's questionable, and I think it could be challenged. I'm not sure that I'm interested in fighting that battle, because now I'm wondering, maybe we shouldn't be also tackling the recall question. Leave that to the Charter Commission when it evolves into a review of the charter somewhere down the road. I have very strong feelings about the recall process, but I don't want to necessarily muddle our focus on this committee. Also, I think, and I know you've expressed this, Mr. Hessler, and I concur with you, I think that there's justification, for instance, in our moving toward not just amending to include a city manager language in the charter, but also how does the council, what is the formation of the council that hires that city manager? And that would open up the question, do we recommend also that the 9 members of the council ought to be elected in some other way? Should there be ward representation? Should there be a possible change in the number of councilors, which happens to be a model that I've thought of, a 5-member council, north, south, east, west, central, so that we assure geographic distribution in the city, and those 5 members possibly getting elected by the whole city, but having to live in the sections from which they come. So the whole population would elect the councilor from the east, from the south, the west, north, and the central. It would move a step toward diversity, but moreover, it would do something to reduce expense, which is, I think, in some ways not the big issue. But moreover, it would then create a body that is more representation of the city when it hires that city manager.
So if I could,
So I'm not sure where we should go. Maybe that's too dramatic a way to go, and I don't want to defeat the effort to maybe have a city manager, keep the 9 members of the council as we have them. I don't know. So I have a lot of unanswered questions.
so I would offer this from my perspective. As a member of this task force, I would think that our next priority then, you just threw a few things out on the table, and one of them, in particular, I was not even thinking was going to fall under our role, and that is the, reappointing of or recommendation to change the current city council arrangement of 9. So with that said, maybe one of our priorities should be, as a task force, to develop a quick questionnaire. Is this, do the members of this task force feel that this is something that you'd be in favor of? Yes or no? If it's no, it's off of our plate, and we don't even have to talk about it anymore. You know, you're suggesting your thought of how the city council could be made up. I may not agree with that. Others may not agree with that. So if we don't have a consensus that we would agree with it, why would we even discuss it anymore? And maybe the next priority should be to establish what is it that we want to really get our arms around and tackle. From my point of view, I thought it was to look at different forms of municipal governments within the state and see if one of them might be a better fit than what we currently have. And now I'm thinking that along with that, we could look at some sample charters and try to agree on one that we think would be a nice amendment to our existing charter for how that would be structured. But that's about as far as I thought I would be involved with this. So, and others may feel differently. And with that, I'll yield.
So on priorities, if you can just slide that, if that mic reaches, Kevin.
Quite clearly, I think I mentioned the last meeting, we can only do what we can do and what we are tasked to do, and we can't make any decisions. We basically would have to just give a recommendation to the council. We also have a charter in place that has a review for the charter coming up. So quite honestly, very narrowly, I've heard from a couple of people, and in doing other research, it does seem like this might be a model that makes sense to the city of Fall River and the people. At that point, I don't know how many more meetings we have to have before we say, okay, this might be a valid thing. Let's put it to the group that is going to be charged with doing a new charter in 2 years, 3 years, whatever the timing is. At that point, that particular body legally is supposed to look at and review and make recommendations for changes at that particular time. So from this member, I'm very comfortable with the fact that a professional manager, like these gentlemen have said, and the research makes some sense. And I think even if we wanted to say, let's do it tomorrow, it can't happen, as we've already been told by Corporation Council. There's a lot of steps that have to go in. The mayor has to agree, all of that stuff. So where I look at as the next priorities is we just, at some point, take a motion to say we think this is a valid thing to look at for the next charter review and get it to the council and let the plans that are already in place go forth. Because why are we going to review a charter that, in the charter, it says in 5 years? I just don't understand why we would even continue to go on. I don't think there's any need for that. So as this member, I'm very comfortable with saying there's some positives that come out of this. It's definitely something that should be explored when the time is right, with the right parameters of a charter review, not just us keep spinning our wheels, coming up with something that may never even occur. With that, I yield.
Any further input today? Mrs. Viveras?
I guess just maybe even some random thoughts based on what my colleagues have said. I agree in some regards. I don't think we want to get in the middle of drafting new charter language until we get some assurance that the council and the mayor are even inclined to support it. I mean, I sat through, as I know you did, Mr. Chairman, many of the Charter Commission meetings, and writing language is a very tedious, long, laborious process. And if we haven't gotten buy-in on the concept from the people who are going to make the decision, then I think we could be spending a lot of time on something that ultimately isn't going to go anywhere, and maybe backpedaling a bit. But I was of the impression that we could recommend a change, that there is a process for home rule and then approval by the local bodies and then ballot referendum, so that we could make this change much sooner than the 5-year window. If we feel strongly it's beneficial, why wait 5 years if we have a mechanism to bring it to the voters much sooner than that? It's just my nature. If we're going to do it, let's get to it and see how it goes. But there again, the council would have to approve the concept. The mayor would have to sign off on the concept. It has to go to home rule, petition to the legislature. to get it on the ballot. Again, if we say we're going to recommend a city manager form of government, and we get 9 city councils that say, no, we don't want to do this, and a mayor that says we don't want to do this, then we're done. I mean, why, go that much further and spend the time that would be involved with recommending a whole new charter provision? I just don't think it's, a good use of our time. So what I was considering as you asked the questions about priorities, I think, and this supports, what Mr. Hetzler had said, I think we as a body might be ready to discuss what changes we feel we could support and would be essential. Maybe we all agree we want a city manager. Maybe for cost reasons, we'd like to recommend that it be a 9-city council. They elect a mayor who's part-time. Now already we're not paying the 2 salaries of a city manager and a mayor. We're just paying a city manager, and maybe there's some cost savings there. I don't know. I'm just throwing options out. Maybe we do want ward councils. Maybe we think the 5-member model that you suggested might be better. I think we've got information available to us now where we can start to form opinions about what we as a body can support, and then take the next step to say, this is what we're recommending and this is not. I don't have a problem with looking at other charters, but I could already tell by the people we've spoken to, a lot of the success within these communities is a function of how they have managed this. If you got one community that's has a practice of hiring people who have political background but not managerial background, then clearly that's not going to help support our cause. That's the direction to take. And to that point, maybe our recommendation also is that it needs to be somebody qualified, and that we're striving to get that level of professionalism that I think everyone's looking for. So if we as a group can agree on the concepts that we support, it may be time to make an interim report out to the city council and maybe the mayor to say, all right, at this level, this is what we're thinking about, this is what we're inclined to support, and try to get read the temperature of the people that are going to have to advance this. And if the temperature is not good, then we're going to spend a lot of time working on things that are really not going to go anywhere, and I don't know that we want to do that. So I'd like to get the consensus amongst the group at this stage. And I'm comfortable at this point. We can certainly bring more folks in. But there was a lot of common theme running through even just the first 2 that we've had regarding professionalism, accountability, the staggering of the terms, I thought was an important element. The role of the elected members and what their function is, I think that's been pretty consistent. The strong manager has a lot of authority and then you have the policy-making body. Very candidly, from a very personal perspective, I don't know that our council is looking to give up authority. I think you've said it many times yourself, I don't know what they see their role as. If we propose something that's actually going to diminish the role of the city council because you're providing so much authority and responsibility in a city manager, we may not get the support from the elected members to go pursue that. So, again, I think we got to get our consensus established. What are the things we think are our priorities that we want to just move forward and get a preliminary assessment, and then if there's consensus and there's support, then we take the next step of developing a charter and language and maybe refining what we believe is important.
Thank you. All the 3 of you who have spoken have really each have presented very good points of view. Any further input? We are trying to keep to a time frame, but Ms. Sadler, Ms. Conrad, do you have any other comments? Okay, I wonder, though, then hearing that maybe rather than bringing in another person for our meeting the 20th, which we could do, there are 2, Mr. Keegan, who's willing to come, and also the Cambridge city manager, Mr. Dave Pasquale, had tentatively agreed, although he'd prefer that we come visit him. And maybe that's what we do instead of bringing somebody else in, that we maybe take our drive to Cambridge. And maybe we set our meeting up on the 20th as just that, a priority.
24th.
24th?
20th is a Saturday.
I've been saying the 20th,
Yeah, no,
the
just wanna-
24th, right.
I was letting it go, but then
Yeah.
I figured.
No, I'm glad
let's
you,
decide,
because
yeah.
this is going on, so the 24th.
4th is a Tuesday.
Right.
It's a golf day, we can't be doing that day.
What, the 24th? Oh,
24th is we play golf on. No, the 24th.
It's a Tuesday, right?
We're talking May or
no,
April?
April 24th.
April 24th is a Wednesday.
Oh, it's a Wednesday.
Wednesday, right.
That was the day we booked last meeting.
Yeah, we had booked that. We had already
Oh.
established that as a
It's
date.
also Linda Burr's 64th birthday.
Well, you can go to the birthday party after the,
When it's on the
after the
phone.
meeting.
Yeah, I don't know. I was gonna say.
Must be
Good for
Facebook
you.
friends or something.
Okay.
So we'll all go to the party, but, yeah, I'm wondering if maybe we make that 24th meeting, rather than have Mr. Keegan come in. With all due respect, I don't know Mr. Keegan. He's probably a great resource for us. But I'd like to try to go to Cambridge, and maybe Worcester. I'm gonna send out I'll ask for, if there are any dates between now and the 24th that work for at least three of us. I thought three of us going might be sufficient, and we can go together, clearly. So let me take it upon myself to do that, to reach out to the six of you to see if there's a day between now and the 24th when we might do that, and set as our primary effort on the 24th to pursue these options. Now, as I mentioned, I have a vision, but I'm tempering my vision with reality. I think that it's very clear that we don't want to spend time rewriting an entire charter when all we are interested in is possibly at this point having a city manager as a recommendation. I think that could be something that we could send, maybe not as a first go-round, that we send it as a final go-round to the council and to the mayor to see if they're willing to move it forward. The language would have to be checked with both Corporation Council and counsel from the Great and General Court, because that's what Ms. Tazzarini,
Tazanari?
Michelle Tazanari suggested that if we do any language change, that we pass it through our Corporation Council and then also pass it through General Counsel to the Great and General Court, so that we don't get caught up in getting things passed back and forth just because the language wasn't absolutely correct. So, again, I just want clarity. Is it the consensus that at our next meeting on the 24th, that we take a look at trying to determine what our collective decision is on what we might want to submit? Yes, Mr. Aguirre?
Just one comment, I think, is Mrs. Viveras made a good point to get some information, so we're not wasting our time here. And it's difficult to get that information from the council per se, because 9 members, you gotta somehow do it. It's a lot easier, I think, to get it from one member, which is the mayor, to just say, is he even inclined to look at a home rule petition from this, to sign it? I wouldn't be inclined, whether it's this mayor or the next mayor or any mayor, that they wouldn't necessarily sign. Somebody that's currently serving in the role of a mayor, I wouldn't do it myself. Like, I'd say, no, I'm doing a good job, I want to keep the job. I wouldn't necessarily say, yeah, I'll sign on to a home rule petition. If that was the case, and that any mayor would not do that, then why are we even wasting our time with this? Let's just move into the other phase of, we'll recommend it to the council or the Charter Review Commission that says, we looked at it and it's something very valid to take a peek at that time. So I don't know if there's a way that we can either have a request put out. I don't know if the mayor would even answer that request because of, and I'm not trying to spot the mayor, I'm just trying to be honest with the fact that if there was a way for you to poll the council, I would ask you to do the same thing. Put a motion on one of your meetings if you can to say, are you inclined to even support a home rule petition if it gets to that point from the task force? If they wanted to take a vote, and as Mrs. Rivera said, 6 members or the majority members say, no, we're not even inclined to do it, on the 24th, we know our marching orders then have to go in a different direction. I think that's what the direction is going to be for the Charter Review Commission at the time, where they would then have to do the other piece. But if there's any way that we could get both of either them to weigh in, I would like to have that, because more knowledge on that is going to at least put that one aside. I don't think we can go for a home rule petition, just being quite honest with you, because you're not going to get all those steps done. So why waste our time? you know, but I'm open to whatever on the 24th, at least getting, I think we're kind of wrapping up our,
Well, the
at some
next-
point, we're
yeah.
wrapping up. you
The
know.
next council meeting is the 23rd.
Well,
Could-
just
If
hold
you
on for a
wanted to
minute.
try
just
to, but
hold
I
on.
don't know.
Hold on for a minute.
Me, you.
Before we go there, we have two things that have happened that I'll share with you. One of which you know of because it was public. The council voted 8-1 for this group to be established for the purpose of considering a change in the charter to have a city manager. So we've had one vote of the council that established this group. So I think that that's at least an indication of the council's willingness to consider a possibility. I also agree with, I think it was you, Mr. Aguirre, who said, or Mrs. Viveras, who said that for us to go to the council and say, well, yes, we are interested in a city manager form of government, and we want to assure the elimination of half of your positions by requiring that there be a 5-member council that come from the north, south, east, west, and south, and only one person can come from each of those, that's not gonna fly. And I can tell you that as much as I embrace that as a intellectual, philosophical construct, I'm not going to embrace it and do it for the sake of doing it, because it wouldn't pass the council. And I understand that these 8 members here and the council president are at least partially about survival of their position. So my inclination and thought at this moment is that if I could get a language that would say, yes, let's consider a city charter amendment to establish a city manager, and that we do it within the confines of the existing construct of 9 council members at large, as we have them now. Let the city charter 5-year plan down the road, look at other possibilities. I'm not inclined to say, as was suggested, that we just send to the future Charter Review Commission, take a look at the city manager form of government. That to me is like doing nothing. They already did look at a city manager form of government. Logically, they would look at it again in 5 years if it's not implemented. I don't think they need us to tell them to look at it. I think we do the most that we can do is make a recommendation to the council. So that was the first item, 8-1 vote. That's why we're here. Let's do our due diligence. I have conversed with the mayor on this matter. He has not said, stop the process. I'm not going to embrace it. He's not said, proceed. I will embrace it. I've also considered that maybe this doesn't go into effect until this mayor, whether it's this term or 2 terms or 5 terms down the road, that it goes into effect upon a new administration. And that the new administration, whenever that new administration comes forward, would be the administration that implements this. Because that's another thing, that it's going to be an administration that has to implement this over a 2-year period. So even if we did adopt something and it went through the council and to the mayor and to the Great and General Court, and the voters voted for it, it then wouldn't go into effect until 2 years after that vote, because there would need to be an implementation process to go from city manager to a chief executive mayor. So I think we've got enough to proceed, and let us gather on the 24th and see if we can come up with something that might be palatable to then proceed to the next step. And Mr. Venice, you can come down to the table. We're already over our time frame, but I know. Just identify yourself by name and address.
Augie Venice, 25 Wrights Way. I would suggest that, you come up with something to put on the November 11th ballot and let the people decide. I mean, you're talking about the city council having to approve it, the mayor having to approve it, but ultimately the people have to approve it. So if they have no will for a city manager, why go through it all? Get a ballot, what do you call it, ballot referendum question for November 11th. And see if the people are willing to accept it. It's sort of like the transfer station. They approved the transfer station. Now we
So
got
it'd be non-binding, yeah.
now we have to do something like that.
Mr. Venice, that's exactly what will have to happen, because I think it's been the consensus that none of this would happen unless there was a vote of the public. But I think you're offering a good alternative, a possible alternative, that rather than we submit to them a amendment to the charter to make this happen as the vote, that maybe we recommend an advisory opinion, and we proceed with doing that in November, to see if the people want us to even continue through to continue through a charter amendment. So the question might be something, do you support the city considering a charter amendment to establish a city manager?
Because ultimately, they're the ones that are gonna decide.
Yeah,
They're gonna have the final vote. If they overwhelmingly say no, then why bother going through all this?
Right. I concur. I think your point is well taken. Okay.
Charter Commission took a poll one time, during their deliberations, it was close, but a lot of people didn't know what a city manager was.
Right.
And the charter was an all or nothing vote.
Yep.
So
Right.
taking it separately might be a different outcome.
Sure. Okay, well, I think we've gotten enough information for the moment. If there's no further business, I'd like to entertain two other votes. One is to accept the minutes of the previous meeting, and
To accept the minutes of the March 20th meeting as submitted.
a motion made and seconded, made by Mr. Hessler and seconded by Mrs. Viveras?
Nope.
No, Ms. Sadler, to accept the minutes as presented. All in favor?
Aye.
So voted. No further business to come before us. A motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Viveras, seconded by Mr. Hetzler. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.